I want to tee this up just with one sort of suggestion, and that is, just as I was thinking that it really paid to start developing a theory of useful evidence, somebody gave me a short book called The Usefulness of Useless Knowledge. And I want to just recommend that to you. It's an essay written by Abraham Flexner, the same Flexner who went on to do little things like reform American medical education and a few other things. It actually is a brilliant statement about the importance of enabling knowledge to be produced even when we don't know if, when, how, whether it will be quote unquote used. I just thought you'd enjoy that as a thing to read on your next plane ride. You should pick it up. It's a great little book. Okay, well, to tee this up, it occurs to me now after yesterday and especially this morning that even though the title of our, the working title of our volume is already a little wordy, I think what we need to maybe think of a way to add to it is useful and usable for whom and why. And I don't know exactly how to do that in a title, but I think part of what is likely to emerge as a theme in the volume is that there are different purposes, uses, and audiences for information that emerges from assessment systems, from tests, from other kinds of data, and so forth. And by the way, I think Ben, right, you reminded me on the food line here that the business of evidence, the word evidence itself, may suggest a certain kind of use that limits our horizon instead of opens it to other possibilities. And what we're really talking about here is something like information, data, knowledge. I'm not sure. But so again, evidence is a catchword, and it has come to mean certain things, especially in the policy context. If you ask people in Washington, what do they mean? What do you think evidence-based policy means? They'll say, oh, randomized trials. And it's too bad, because actually evidence comes in many forms. And anyway, so as a way of teeing this up, then, we're very fortunate to have two people who have both produced and used research-based evidence and knowledge. Carl, a little bit more at the state and local level. Becca, a little bit more from the perspective of national policy. And I think I would then ask, if I could, and of course you can do whatever you want, I'll just ask a question, but then after that you're on your own, to think about this business of useful to whom, for what purposes, maybe as a way to help us bring some more coherence to this. So we have until, I don't have my thing in front of me, but we're supposed to actually adjourn, or at least conclude this session at 1:45? Great.
1:15.
1:15.
Yeah.
Yes. Well, that's before the audience, the other participants get to weigh in on this. So if that's okay, let's run the show. I'll start with you, Carl. Go ahead.
All right. I'm going to state my biases up front. First, thank you to all the paper presenters and discussants for making my second full week of retirement very interesting and stimulating. I belong to the practitioner tribe, and so getting to useful and usable, my comments will be in that context. The last 7 years I've been involved in state educational policy making, first as a state board member for 4 years, and then the past 3 years launching a new state agency, and it's been an interesting ride with Governor Brown, who is arguably the current leader of the free world. So we start up front with our biases. It is alleged that Wayne Gretzky was an outstanding hockey player and athlete because he always knew where the puck was going next. And I would argue that this proposed volume needs to be more about where the puck is going next or where the puck should go next. And that also links to Michael's useful to whom and for what purposes. Some things that I know for sure in terms of where the puck isn't going next. There will not be more discussion of test-based teacher accountability. There will be no revisiting of value added. There will be no relitigating of aspects of the Vergara trial, including LifeCo, last in, first out. And I make these points based on what hasn't been discussed for the past 2 days. There are at least 3 elephants in the room that haven't been discussed and will, in my judgment, greatly influence the future direction of assessment in our country. The first is the election of Donald Trump and the appointment of Betsy DeVos as Secretary of Education. The second is the red state teacher revolt. And the third is the potential of unintended policy consequences of the Janus decision. I believe that all 3 of those factors will have a significant impact on the future direction of assessment in our country. I don't know about international settings. On the way to corporate reform, for lack of a better term, and it's sometimes emphasis on test-based teacher accountability, one of the unanticipated things was the election of Donald Trump and the appointment of Betsy DeVos. And I look at that, the point of view, you know, we have this highly contested race for state superintendent in California. And a young man ran 4 years ago, Marshall Tuck. And you would think that now that the incumbent is gone, that he might do well, but he's not. He's going to lose because Trump and DeVos are in place, and now the so-called corporate reform movement owns Trump and DeVos. And everyone who kind of started out with, you know, we really care about kids and we want to make all of these improvements, they're spending a lot of time trying to explain how they are divorced from Trump and DeVos. Choice, charters, all of that. Now you've got to answer with regard to Trump and DeVos. It's not a good place to be. The red state teacher revoked. It's a fascinating development. All of these places that don't have collective bargaining, where teachers said, you know what, we've had enough, and we're going to march, we're going to organize. Fascinating thing about California, and I just went on a board of the Institute for Teaching, which is a part of the California Teachers Union. They said, we're trying to say to our people here in California, you don't need to go on strike. We have a great relationship with Governor Brown. We're the bluest of blue states. We have this great relationship with Governor Brown, and we're going to have an even better relationship with Gavin Newsom, who's going to be the next governor. So let's not man the barricades. Let's not throw down the gauntlet. It's not working. There will be a strike in Los Angeles because of the red state teacher revolt. California teachers are saying, don't bother me with all this wonderful blue state stuff. We want to be in solidarity with West Virginia and Arizona. Arizona's an amazing place. One of our news outlets did a story about a teacher in Arizona who, by increasing his commute by only 5 minutes, comes across the border and teaches in California now. His salary went from $40,000 to $80,000. And so you can imagine the leadership of CTA going, now, wait a minute, folks. Anyway, an elephant in the room that's going to influence all this. And then the potential unintended consequences of the Janus decision. There have a lot of people been salivating for a long time about these unions are going to get their comeuppance and the Supreme Court's going to strike down agency shop. So I spent last Thursday at the headquarters of the Teachers Union in California as a part of this board on the Institute for Teaching. Here are the numbers. Since the Janus decision, statewide, the Teachers Union has lost 300 plus members. You know how many they've gained? 5,000 plus. Now, they're anticipating that in the next year or so, the Koch brothers are going to tee it up and really come after them. But the initial data suggests where everybody thought this horrible union's going away, they've actually increased membership since the Janus decision. So I'm arguing that all of this will be very much in play as we look to the future. Now, we all know that ESSA devolves authority to the states, and California currently devolves even more authority to the local level with increased funding for those kids who are poor, learning English, and in foster care. And you can debate what kind of progress is being made. I would argue, take a look at Rucker Johnson and Sean Tanner of the Learning Policy Institute, their research brief, Money and Freedom, the Impact of California's School Finance Reform. And overall, I'm arguing, even though everybody calls us the left coast and thinks we're a little kooky, I'm arguing that California is probably in the forefront of where the puck is going next. So my job the past 3 years has been to create a new kind of state agency designed to get the right kind of help to districts, charters, and county offices. Everybody on my staff, we wear these wristbands that says, and it's called the California Collaborative for Educational Excellence, CCEE, the right kind of help, which suggests that No Child Left Behind and Race to the Top were, in fact, the wrong kind of help. Test, punish, shame in a top-down manner is a huge negative in terms of motivating adults to do better. How do I know this? Because I actually served as school superintendent in 2 districts. And one of the most profound influences on me, when I was a rookie superintendent, we decided we wanted to upgrade our research and assessment office. I didn't know where to go, so I went to, having gotten my doctorate from UCLA, I went to Eva Baker of the Crest Center, and I said, Eva, we want to upgrade our research and assessment. What should we do? Do you have somebody for us? She did. She said, I've got Lynn Winters, one of my top lieutenants who wants to get back in a district. And the rest is history. When we talked about the issue of how we could improve student performance, one of the things Lynn said early on was, let's not talk about raising test scores. Let's talk about putting the right kind of supports in place for our most vulnerable students. Talking about raising test scores is like nails on a chalkboard for real classroom teachers. It is not an incentive to do better. So that's what we did. We didn't talk about raising test scores, but we constantly talked about putting the right kind of help and support in place for the most vulnerable students. The good news is that we ended up winning the Broad Prize for Excellence in Urban Education and also being recognized in McKinsey's global study of school systems that are getting better. Without talking about raising test scores, so the other thing that it's important to reveal, the really big gains in student achievement took place years 5 through 10 of my time there. It didn't mean that we weren't working the initial few years. We were doing a lot of stuff. Our mantra was high standards, dress, behavior, and achievement. President Clinton, you may recall, was really taken with school uniforms. He came to Long Beach to praise what we were attempting to do. A few days after President Clinton was there, someone wrote a letter to our local newspaper, and they said, Carl Cohn is sometimes described as a bold, innovative leader. I disagree. All he's giving us is a 1950s parochial school education, and we could have paid a nun a lot less than we're paying him. So, I'm arguing, think carefully about where we're going. Don't ignore these elephants in the room. You can get there with all the economic benefits that Rick talks about improving test scores, but don't talk about it. Thank you.
Okay, that was, I can't be nearly as entertaining, but that was a great tee-up for, I think, where I want to go. So I've shredded everything. I sort of, all my notes from yesterday. I think this actually takes me back to 7 years ago when I walked into the Institute of Education Sciences and we had Race to the Top and all kinds of evidence. That's all we were concerned about was evidence. And evidence meant that you had numbers and you had to do something with those numbers, and there were hierarchies, and money was going to go out the door, and people were going to love you or hate you based on how this all went. And it was a little bit of chaos. We also had another condition that I had some prior experience with. We had the sort of the research wars, if you will, over experimentation and whether the only good evidence out there came from RCTs, and if it wasn't an RCT, could you use a QED, and what about that other stuff that people thought was really good? So I had some experience with that from 15 years, and having come from the RCT world and industry to an academic environment where nobody wanted to see an RCT. And I had sort of mastered those methods wars, if you will. And what I took into government, and I think served us well, was the notion that fits well with Carl's, which is we had to figure out what was our purpose for being. Our purpose for being, my purpose for being in the research world, and my purpose for being in government was to improve outcomes for kids, to have a better educational system. And the reason for that was because that meant a better society. So I think in this whole, what started to come together for me today was we need to, I think, have this volume organized around what is the what's the big purpose, the central purpose of assessment. And I think the central purpose of assessment in the context of education is somehow to make education better. So whatever it is that you are assessing, if you're doing it in the classroom with individual teachers, if you're doing it online, if you're doing it sort of up the chain with a PIAC or a NAEP kind of assessment, the intent is the same. So I think we share that goal. And I think if we can share that goal, then we sort of know where we want the puck to go at least. And then we sort of have to, I think, in each of these zones, we start thinking about what is the purpose of this assessment, and how do I think about constructing it, judging it, because we also need to assess our assessments, right? We need to know about the reliability, the validity. We haven't talked a lot about that, but there are better and worse assessments. But I think more importantly, there are better and worse assessments for different purposes. So, and some of these, wars, the wars we got into in education research were, I've come to believe, are more about whether we are applying evidence, as much about, I shouldn't say only about, but as much about, are we applying evidence for the right purpose? Should I take a small-scale RCT that was extremely well done, and should I go and tell a teacher how to now reorganize her class based on the results of that experiment? Probably not. And we could have more arguments about that. So I think one of the missing pieces in this volume, as it's been presented in the last 2 days, is I think you need a framework. And I think you need a framework that honors all genres of assessment, if you will, that actually fit into the space that you're working in. And I think you had a nice range of assessments here, from the international down to the classroom level, and including even some of this online work, which I think fits nicely, could translate, though it was talked about more in the K-12 space, it would fit in the higher ed space. Addressing some of Judy Singer's concerns. So I think my big recommendation or suggestion is to step back a little bit, see if you can, in an introductory chapter, or maybe, maybe each of you, as you revise your papers, start out sort of thinking about where's your space in assessment? What nugget here are you taking on? And then just, stay in that zone, but try to also think about how to connect it. So I think a missing piece, for example, I think is when we talk about in the classroom, I think those of you working in that space, are really not thinking about it just in that classroom, because you have, whether you are explicit or not, you're sort of thinking about, well, that really is because I think the students ultimately need to have this knowledge, these skills, and that's going to connect to readiness for the next level, and it's going to connect eventually to those ACT and SAT tests that you may or may not believe in, but the students have to take, and they're consequential at the present. So, and on up the chain to, we actually want a strong economy. We know that sort of, whether we believe exactly those NAEP and PI tests, we know that they're strongly predictive. So they're measuring something in there that seems to be related to those outcomes. So we can, we can improve upon the tests, but at least for those purposes, they seem to be doing a pretty good job. So I think part of what we're maybe missing is some of this connective tissue across these types of tests and genres of tests, and maybe a little more sort of just explicit consideration of an acknowledgement of how well a particular assessment or test fits the purpose to which I am applying it. And I think, the paper that Ben and team talked about, where you're actually using a lot of different tests and trying to use them for other purposes, I think that's a great thing to do, and I think you did a nice job and much better than the average of sort of highlighting the strengths and limitations of that, because you are pushing the envelope a little bit when you start sort of mushing together assessments and data from multiple sources. And I think that's a good thing to do, but it is important, as you did, to sort of say, well, I'm now not in the rigor of an RCT, sort of giving you an estimate with a point estimate and confidence interval, but I'm giving you sort of some nice, descriptive information that can support hypothesis generation, can maybe be informative, give some feedback. So I think an important contribution to the strength of this volume, I think, would be if there could be a little bit more of this sort of bridging the gaps across the different kinds of assessments, and sort of what they're intended to do, what their strengths are, how you judge them in terms of their appropriateness, strength, limitations for that purpose. And I think we do always, we use QEDs when we don't have RCTs. But we're starting to, I think, get in the groove of holding our heads high and acknowledging that it's okay. I mean, we didn't have the gold standard, so we've got the bronze, and we're going to still use it because it's better than nothing. When we don't have that, we might have some good correlational evidence that will inform us. And oftentimes, it's useful to put these things together, the classroom observations, together with the state assessments, together with the, the SAT and the ACT. So I think, I think that's the big message I want to leave you with. And I will just share with you one of the struggles that I think I'm most proud of, maybe from my time in government, which is we worked, I was at the Institute of Education Sciences in the evaluation shop, and we worked with the evidence team across government and the National Science Foundation to develop common evidence guidelines for education research. Probably one of the hardest things I've ever worked on, but we got there, and we got acceptance from people we never thought would buy into this. And the idea there was to just think about all genres of education research and trying to write on, produce the roadmap that would, define what the home, the primary home, and the connective links were across these genres of evidence, so that people knew if you are doing an exploratory study or a causal inference study, a formative assessment, where do you belong in the space, and be comfortable in that, and do a good job in that space, and don't try to do a correlational study and claim it's an RCT, because you don't need to. You've done a good study, and I think most of the misuse of evidence is, and the problems we get into is when we don't understand what zone we're in, what lane we're in, and keep it there. And I've started looking at research very differently. There's a lot of good research out there that is not being interpreted and used and applied in the right lane, and then it's not good. So it's not good for the purposes to which the authors are often suggesting it be used for. And I think that, so I think we can do a lot to sharpen this volume by just being mindful of that. So I think I'll just leave it there. So.
So I want to press on both of you to maybe give us an example of, in your specific contexts, so Carl either in Long Beach or wherever, and Becca maybe when you were at IES, an example of where information that comes from some kind of a formal educational testing or assessment instrument mechanism was used to answer a policy question, and how did that work? How did it go? Or how didn't it go? Or you can answer another question.
Well, I mean, in a lot of the evidence-based decision-making that's gone on, I mean, the issues there are, do you not give out any money because you don't have any evidence on something, which means that we sort of halt progress, right? I mean, we don't know how best to address a certain challenge with special education students, and we don't have any good RCTs that tell us, this is a proven program. So do we just say, too bad, sorry about that one, or do we pull up our socks and sort of say, okay, well, we've got some really good work that's been done out there with teachers who are working with, disruptive autistic children in the classroom, and it's very promising. So how do we gauge the evidence for that and say, okay, that will be a really good bet. Let's put the resources out there to do that. But it's not a free ride just because you didn't have evidence and you got a good idea. What the quid pro quo we decided was, okay, yeah, we're going to fund that. We accept there isn't anything to go on there, but we want you to generate some good evidence coming out of that. Okay, so that is how a lot of the evidence-based funding has rolled out. It's not perfect, because the other thing they did that I don't think was very wise is that if you have more evidence, you get more money, and sometimes there's no logic to that, because there are things that cost a lot to do, and or that a little bit of movement in the outcome would have really big payoffs, and then there are things where it could be very cheap to do. So if it's a little nudge experiment, just because you've got an RCT that said that will move college enrollment by a point or two, why do you want to give millions of bucks to that? And itty bitty bit bucks to something just because it doesn't have more evidence. But I think the idea is in the right direction, is that we need to start someplace and just encourage people to, when they give the evidence, generate the new evidence, they understand that we want evidence should be valuable whether it supports your hypothesis going in, whether you were totally upside down and it was a really bad idea, or maybe it just wasn't enough. So you should always design the study so you will make use of the evidence, whatever it is. I mean, I think that's the other part of it. We want that evidence reported. We don't want the file drawer. If you like the results, you publish it. If you don't. So I think, I mean, that was not easy to get that through, but you had to find ways to, mediate that process, and having that clear, the common evidence guidelines helped us enormously. So you could support the decisions you were making. And it's not that we think those guidelines are perfect, but it's a starting place, and getting some agreement was, I think, a huge deal.
Carl, did you have cases in which you were able to use some kind of evidence to either alter a position, change course, inform a legislator? Give us an example.
So one of the things that we focused on in Long Beach early on was the whole issue of early literacy. And this sort of grew out of my own experience. I went off, came from a dysfunctional family. My mom was a victim of domestic violence. She was raising 6 of us by herself. Went on to first grade at St. Anthony's School in Long Beach, and a nun taught me to read in the first grade like all the other kids who came from more advantaged backgrounds. That single activity probably made the difference in my life. So early literacy and youngsters who weren't reading at grade level, by the end of 3rd grade, we decided we were going to have this mandatory 5-week summer school. And one of the things that we found out, everybody said, well, this is public school. You can't require anybody to do anything. And we said, well, yes, we can, and we're going to. And so we persisted in providing and investing significant amounts of money in early literacy, which actually over time paid off in terms of student performance. I think those types of things that actually start, and we didn't actually give these youngsters a test. We had them sit with an individual teacher and a benchmark book, and that's how we decided who was going to be eligible for the summer school type program. But those kinds of investments, changes in policy and practice, including mandatory summer school, actually paid off big time.
Did you want to get in on this, Mike Nettles?
If I understand your question correctly,
You're a better man than I.
I won't go that far, but I think you did not qualify the evidence basis on whether it's good evidence or sufficient evidence or the quality of the evidence. And I would submit that most public policy in education is informed by evidence, the quality of which varies. So, for example, if you take basic education formulas, legislatures use some estimates of what it cost before they decide to establish the formula, right? And they have an algorithm for doing it. And then you have organizations like the Education Law Center that comes along with evidence suggests that the evidence that they're using is not sufficient because it doesn't discriminate on the basis of need of school districts and that kind of thing. If you look at a praxis examination, you might conclude that it informs policies about the supply and demand of teachers in states and school districts. They even establish cut scores to decide who's going to be a teacher. Now, whether they're suggesting that those people are going to be effective teachers, I don't think so. So then there's another set of evidence that needs to come along to make those kind of judgments, right? So to the one final example would be in post-secondary education, the ability to benefit. Evidence, that vocational proprietary institutions have to submit in order to demonstrate that, they deserve student financial aid and other things. So my question would be, and my amendment to your question would be, how do we get sufficient high-quality evidence to inform these policies, especially in the assessment world?
Okay, yeah, I see neither of you want to answer that.
Well, I think some of the answer to how you get good quality evidence is to have good quality research that connects the measures that you're using to the outcomes that you want to achieve. So it would be quite possible, for example, when we were having the conversation of ACT and SAT use yesterday, it would be really easy for colleges and universities to run experiments where they didn't use that information in their admissions process to see, what difference, given other things, everything else is the same except you mask a piece of information for a random subset of your applicants. Does it change, who gets in and who doesn't? Does it change, whether, the outcomes for your school? So there are ways to actually get that, predictive and in some cases causal evidence on whether or not those tests are measuring the things that you want it to measure. And I think that's part of having reliable use, validation and use of the tests and assessments for the purposes for which you are intending them to be used.
Can we go to another question? Carl? Yeah, Maris.
I probably shouldn't ask this question because I'm going to have to leave soon, and if I did, I would leave happy. Because I've heard a happy story, and I hope it's true. On the other hand, I'm very skeptical because California, big as it is and should be an independent country maybe, may not be America. So one of the things I think is very important in this volume, which is missing, is really a discussion of a major change. The paper I did ends in 2016 deliberately. We have shifted from the 30 years of the federal government setting the goals that no one can reach, and we can debate all that all we want. But 3 years ago, just almost 3 years ago now, we changed the system. We're now going to the states. We're now using evaluations of the states, and there's a new regime. I would like to think that any reader is going to pick up this volume, is going to have some commentary what's happened in the last 3 years, and maybe even some dangerous predictions about the next 3 years. And so the question to the two of you is, what has happened? What do you think will happen? And will California be the forthcoming 3 years?
Sure. The district that we've worked the longest with is the Palo Verde School District in the city of Blythe, which is in the desert on the California-Arizona border. The data revealed that it was, in fact, the lowest performing district in Riverside County for 2 decades. Incontrovertible, everyone Agreed. We've been working there for 2 years, working alongside of the folks rather than coming in and dictating top-down prescriptive approaches. Doesn't mean we're not bringing significant help. 3 weeks ago, the real Deborah Ball was in Blythe, actually beginning the process. They've had a challenge with elementary math scores, beginning the process of high-quality professional development in a community that no one cares about. So that's the kind of different help that we're bringing. What's interesting in terms of results, this school district that had been on everybody's list for 2 decades did not turn up on the new California school dashboard, which people can debate about the dashboard, but did not, for the first time, turn up as needing assistance from the state and is no longer the lowest performing district in Riverside County. That's an N of 1, and it's an anecdote, but it's the beginning of what I think is significant change.
Yeah, Susanna. Oh, I'm sorry, Henry has the microphone and therefore the floor. Oh, Henry, that's mighty yielding of you.
So nice of you. I don't know if you, oh, there we go. So how would you have known to go to Blythe without assessment that was consistent across the state, and how would you know they would be removed now?
Yeah, well, I mean, the Riverside County superintendent came to me and said, I've got this district and we need another pair of eyes. We've had people there since beyond No Child Left Behind. Actually, California had something called IIUSP, Immediate Intervention for Underperforming Schools. They went back 2 decades. Yeah, so assessment, reveal, but our being there, physically present, revealed a lot more.
That's totally makes sense. It's more just, you've got a big state with 1,000 districts. How do you know where you can go with a small thing? It's nice to have the measures that go across the state.
Precisely.
Henry.
Well, Carl, the story you just told actually fits with the question I was going to ask, because it seems to me, and given the nature of our group here, it's quite reasonable that when we talk about evidence, we're talking about material information that comes to us through rigorous studies of whatever type. What we seem to be ignoring is the power of the story. That a dozen RCTs may not have the same impact as a powerful story about what works or what doesn't work in terms of the larger population and legislators and so on. And I'm thinking of in the last week in the New York Times Magazine, they had their education issue, several stories about teachers teaching, one of which was about a district or a school in Georgia serving mostly African-American students, very poor, and the struggles of that principal who was a student in that school years before, to get that school moving and to really assist the students who come from, in general, very troubled families and neighborhoods, to help them achieve at high standards. And I wonder whether we shouldn't be thinking more broadly than we usually do, given our backgrounds, in terms of evidence. And I think it relates to the issue of the three elephants in the room that you began with, because it seems to me that dealing with those issues in terms of complex adaptive systems, that good stories, based, we hope, on real data, but taken as stories, may be more powerful than the kinds of evidence that we focus on and believe should have more of an impact on policy. than it does. And I'd like to hear both your impressions of that.
Agreed, and one of the things we're trying to do is to put together cases that describe the districts that we're working with. The other thing, I lived in the large urban bubble for almost 4 decades, and this new job has been amazing in that it gets you out of that large urban bubble to all of these other places in California that are actually majority Latino districts because of agriculture. And big media never covers that. So I think the power of this type of story with a community that economically has been left behind and is isolated, but Deborah Ball is there with her Teaching Works people. I think that's a powerful emerging story.
Can I just add?
Oh, of course, yeah.
I just want to add a footnote to that, though. I think that the danger is having it be either stories or the evidence, because I think the power is when we start putting those together and expecting both. So the stories can be motivating to do more of it, but sooner or later, you should have the evidence, because sometimes the stories are wrong. Sometimes you would be just coming in at a point when the district was going to come out of its slump anyhow, or vice versa. And that's why I like having the depth of what's going on in the classroom together with what's going on really at the higher levels, where we can sort of show that children are actually moving up and eventually going to get those higher paying jobs, because the education really did produce more of what we need for them to be high performing later on.
Bill?
In listening to the conversation, especially when Carl started, the examples for me that he gave point to the importance of really strong conceptualization of what the challenges are if you're going to develop good evidence, if you're going to find good evidence. There has to be that kind of conceptualization piece. Sometimes stories do give us a way of refining our understanding of the nature of the problem itself. Talking to incumbents, the indigenous people who are in that context, knowing that does help us refine and build the accuracy of what we're going to build as a response. I don't think we can ignore that kind of rich conceptualization in designing appropriate strategies or appropriate assessments.
Good, let's pass the mic up here to, who's next, Lori? Great.
I just wanted to actually say something in response to Susanna's question, and to offer advice, as we all are, to the culminating chapter that you will be writing. I think it's very useful, as has been suggested, that a framework that distinguishes these uses is one thing we've heard, and surely you will do that. But I think that it's also important that in sorting among these uses that you try to write the balance. Because my answer to Susanna is, well, yes, they needed those test scores, but they didn't need it on every kid
every
for
week.
hours and hours, over and over and over again. And so in the list that I think Scott provided of some alternative ways to get the kind of data you need for those kinds of decisions, when does it need to be separated to safeguard against misuses? And when does it need to have some resonance between different levels of assessment? So I think redressing the balance is one thing I hope you will address.
Any other easy-to-implement suggestions are most welcome here. Well, I must say, I'm very moved that one of my favorite mathematical statisticians in the world is recommending more use of anecdotal and story evidence. I like that, and that's better it comes from him than from a storyteller like me. So good. We have to make note of that too. Do you want to get in on this, Jim? You're just holding the mic. Okay. So here's something of what I think we're going to have to use as we do these culminating paragraphs or chapter. I get the sense that you think this volume would have more value if it really does do some of this kind of distinguishing and clarifying for different audiences why there are these debates about educational measurement and how different types of measures are designed for different purposes, and then maybe to go from there and talk about issues of use and overuse or underuse, and then think a little bit about the business of balance. I like that a lot, actually. Other framing things that you think we might not have yes, go ahead. Keep going, Lori.
I just want to add a little bit more.
Yeah.
I also hope that when you're describing what's possible and looking to the future, that I heard you say multiple audiences. The audience that we most need to take care in addressing is the policy community, because they get very enthusiastic about these things. So I think investing in doing some of the things that we heard about this morning without promising that the cheap version of, let's say, technology-enhanced assessment is what they want. So they get the glowing version of it, and then they purchase the cheap thing. And we've already got lots of that out there. So I encourage you to use the levels that John identified. That's awesome. But right now they are still investing in level 1. School districts are buying it. It's unbelievable how much money is being spent on really just electronic worksheets. Please save us from that.
Rebecca.
Well, particularly because this is a collaboration with political scientists, I think it would be great if your framing chapter would provide some of the national political context along the lines of what Carl is suggesting, as well as the politics within the education and the assessment world. I think that would be really terrific.
Sorry. You didn't take that? No. It's just somebody saying my SAT scores have been adjusted finally. And who needs them?
In which direction? So,
yes, indeed.
just actually a little different take than what Lori just said, but not in total disagreement. But I do think the educational measurement community has spent most of its life focusing on these large-scale assessments. And so I think in terms of clarifying the purposes, to portray these examples of what evidence to support instructional and learning purposes can be, would be an important statement. We have a lot of stuff on how to make large-scale tests. But I think then what Lori's advice, where I thought I was going to disagree when you started, but I think I'm coming around, as where I think that we have to get to is then provide some educative framing or chapters for what Lori just advised. It's for policymakers that, yes, these are for instructional purposes, and if you create poor proxies and put a lot of consequences on them, you will distort anything you do in this case. And so it's something we're wrestling with, and I don't have an easy answer. If I did, I'd give it to you, is how do we build this literacy among policymakers so they would actually know a good thing from a bad thing. And it's hard. It's, you know. Keeping the mic on this side.
I'm going to build on that directly in terms of, well, how do we do that? You invoked the Carol Weiss yesterday, and also the using science and evidence and policy. We often have what I call a faith-based approach to evidence-based policy, meaning it's not based on empirical research on how and when people actually do use evidence, right? So part of having a non-faith-based model is knowing how and when and where decisions are made and by whom, and how and when to engage research. And one of the big findings of that NRC report was that you need long-term collaborative engagements between practitioners or among practitioners, policymakers, and researchers. And so where are those use cases in the room with assessment? Like, I think there are some, but I feel like that needs to be part of the framing. And I mentioned to you yesterday, Becca and I are both part of, with another hat on. I'm the director of the PI for the National Center for Research and Policy and Practice. We're an IES-funded center. Becca's at Research for Schools, which is a parallel center out of Delaware. We're doing a lot of studies about how, when, and where leaders use research. And guess what? It's not mostly around selecting interventions and programs. It's actually what leaders do every day is design professional development for other leaders and construct meetings. And so there's all sorts of evidence that could come into play, but you have to know that that's what people are doing in the day-to-day, and that's when the decisions would be made. So that's just a little sliver.
Yeah, no, that's a wonderful coda to this, because it's also a reminder that we have come a long way in understanding more about the practical side of the research to practice and the research to policy world, partly because of your work, by the way, so thank you for that. It's been actually quite, what's the word I'm looking for here, transformative in some ways, because it has set new criteria and a new direction for the field. And, you know, so the William T. Grant Foundation, Spencer Foundation, I think the Hewlett Foundation has expressed some interest in this too. We should leave here then optimistic about the way in which research has influenced policy. And in this case, it's the policy of some of these foundations that are paying for us to keep doing some of this work. I could go on, but we have to wrap this up. Okay, so let's have two more parsimonious comments from Rick and Susanna, and then we're going to let Amy tell us what happens next.
So I agree with you, Lori, that we need balance in this. The balance I see is that U.S. performance as measured by people who do assessments looks pretty flat for the last 40 years in the face of all of these brilliant ideas that we've had. If we reproduced this meeting 10 years ago, we would have had another different set of brilliant ideas, but we have these brilliant ideas about how these things would improve on their own, and we haven't seen it. We have provided lots more resources to support those brilliant ideas, and we haven't seen it. And what I see is that the future of the U.S. really depends upon improving things. And your idea is that it's improved at the individual classroom level, and that we can then take what you know at the individual classroom level and move it to the other 100,000 schools. But we haven't seen that in the past. So the question is, if you want to have balance, is how do you match the national interest, which I think is about improving the quality of our people, our citizens. How do we match that with all the brilliant ideas and get that balance?
That's the conference that begins at 5 this afternoon will begin with that question. Susanna.
Not surprisingly, I have somewhat a similar comment, is that generally I think that transparency helps us to address issues of inequality and all of those kinds of things. So I want to kind of not lose this same idea that we can get a lot by having some of this understanding about how kids are learning in different places and for different kids, and that having that information is actually really important for reaching some of the goals that I think we all have in the room. But on top of that, I think maybe I'm just optimistic, but I feel like we can create tests, or that side of the room can create tests, that are actually kind of learning experiences, and tests don't have to be like fill in these bubbles and it's a miserable experience because I'm doing this. We can, I hope, move the testing experience to one that captures multiple capacities that we care about and that actually benefits the kids while they're doing it as well. So I don't think our current state has to be the state that we're in, either our state of not knowing what we should know or the experiences kids have in testing.
That's wonderful. I appreciate, no, I mean it. I appreciate being able to leave this meeting with some optimism. I am a congenital optimist, but I have to tell you it's getting harder and harder. But this gives me some hope. I want to thank Becca and Carl, and by the way, I want to say a special thank you for the hockey metaphor, because Carl could have chosen the baseball metaphor, and hockey for a Washingtonian is another source of optimism, as opposed, at least currently, to baseball. So, thank you. Amy's now going to tell us what happens next.
I guess one thing I would say, though, is that while I feel like you guys are giving us a lot of food for thought for what to do with the introduction and what to do with the conclusion, but some of these ideas I feel like can be weaved in your papers by referencing some of the other papers also. And so I know Maris had to leave, but he and I were talking about how some of the ideas that came up were suggestions for his paper maybe could go into the NAEP paper. So like how maybe you guys could, when you're thinking about your NAEP paper, none of them are looking at me. They don't know I'm talking to them. They don't know that they're the NAEP paper people. How instead of Maris trying to weave into the history paper the use of computers and the technology boom and how that went forward, maybe that could be partly in the history at the NAEP section, and it could be something that he could reference, but not have to so far deviate from what he's thinking about into it. But a lot of NAEP being NAEP was because of this boom in computerization and so forth at the end of World War II. But just thinking about how we can reference, or how you all can reference each other's papers, I think will make it a more coherent volume, and we'll worry about the citation part of that, later on. And then, I'm supposed to show you. So if you have those papers for AAPSS, we will take them, the copyright signatures. And this is what we talked about. You guys have seen it in emails. I'll put it in the presentation folder that I'm going to share with all of you. But just to give you a sense, the sooner the better that discussants could get written feedback to their authors. Some have already done it. Some are in the process. That'd be wonderful. You'll be hearing from all of us, the special editors. We will have written feedback on all the papers within the next 3 weeks. Yes, no, we will. And then the revisions and so forth. You have all of our emails. You know at least one of us pretty well, all of you. So feel free to reach out if you want something in a shorter time frame or you have questions so that you're not spinning your wheels while you're waiting to hear from us. Any questions? Yeah.
Can you give us a document, like a hard document that's how we're supposed to do everything? Can you email us?
Yes. Okay, I will email that. Good idea. Okay. I again want to thank you all for donating your time and your thoughts and your energies to this project. I thank you from the Academy, from both academies. We really, really appreciate it. It's a labor of love, and we hope it births well. So thank you all. Okay.